Continue with our Gemara. We are in Sanhedrin, Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph 113a. We're in the very last daf, in the last folio. So only a couple of more classes till we conclude this chapter, which we began almost a year ago today. And I'm still considering what tractate we'll do going forward. What I'm thinking of at the moment, and I'd love to hear your input. You can email me or text me or comment on this video. What I'm considering doing after this is the last tractate in Yoma. Yoma is a tractate, which means the literal translation of the word Yoma is the day, referring to the big day of the year, Yom Kippur. And it's got 8 chapters. And the first 7 discuss in great detail and great length, very fascinating, the procedure of the high priest in the Holy of Holies and the temple in general on this holiest of days. Now, the last chapter, chapter 8, can be divided into 2 segments. One is practical. It talks about the laws of fasting on Yom Kippur, the laws of not wearing leather shoes, and basically all the practices of Yom Kippur that still exist today, as opposed to the first 7, which only exist during the times of the temple. And the other part of that last chapter is a lengthy discussion on the topic of teshuvah. So I think these 2 things might be interesting. There's a practical element to it, and there's the drush, there's the messages, there's the lessons that we learn from it, which is kind of, over the past few years, when we've been doing these daily Gemara, that's been like our 2 focuses. We've either focused on Gemara that has some practical relevance, or drush, things that have lessons and messages and things of that nature. So I think the last chapter of Yoma has both these elements. It's got the practical, what's the practical law related to Yom Kippur, and as we've done in the past when we've learned practical law, we're going to introduce the Code of Jewish Law to actually translate the Gemara's teachings into the way we practice till this very day, with some practical application. And likewise, we have the messages and the ideas of teshuvah, especially as we're going to be approaching towards Elul, and whatever tractate we take next, we're going to be going through Elul and probably through Tishrei as well. It'd be nice to have some of that information as well. So I'm putting this out there to you. These are my thoughts at the moment, the last tractate in Yoma, the last chapter in the tractate of Yoma. If you have any other suggestions or comments on this, or if you like it, don't like it, please let me know via email, text, or commenting on this video. And with that, we continue with our Gemara. Of course, we're discussing the law of the Ir HaNidachas, the city that's been subverted and redirected to serve idols. We've called it the castaway city, and the various different laws that go around it. We discussed that the people of the city get killed. We discussed the property that has to get destroyed, and we discussed at length the property that's in the sea that belongs to heaven. Sacrifices, things that have been donated as teruma or meiser, donated to the priest, to the Levite, and all the various different laws around that. We have one last item in that category, and then we're going to move on to, the law of rebuilding, the prohibition against rebuilding Ir HaNidachas, rebuilding this castaway city once it's been destroyed. So first, let's discuss that one last item that cannot be destroyed as part of the city. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the top of the page, third to last word. Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph 113a. Kisvei HaKodesh Yignizu. Holy Scripture, scrolls that have some scripture written on it with God's name, cannot be destroyed, obviously, it's holy. But on the other hand, it's property of the castaway city and therefore cannot be used, and therefore it's buried in deference to its holiness, similar to what we discussed with some of the other items. Meiser and the Bechar, the firstborn, where it belongs to the castaway city and therefore cannot be used, cannot be offered, but in deference it's let to rot or something of that nature. Or in some cases, according to some opinions, it's let to pasture until it dies, and all the details we discussed about that at length. So now with respect to scriptures, holy scriptures that are found in a castaway city. So the Gemara comments like this: Masnisa in our Mishnah, which ruled that scrolls which have holy scripture written on them from a castaway city must be buried. This, the loik Rabbi Lezer, is not in line with the view of Rabbi Lezer. The Tanya, what we've learned in a Mishnaic age text, Rabbi Lezer says, Kol ir sheyesh ba, any city that has afilum mezuza achas, even one mezuzah in the entire city, eine nasas Ir HaNidachas, it cannot become a castaway city. We talked about at the beginning the qualifications for becoming a castaway city, and we discussed how difficult it is to actually qualify, because each of the people who serve idols have to be warned with the whole complex legal system that we described earlier, and it has to be two men of the city, of the same tribe, and all the details described earlier. Now here's another detail according to Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Lezer says that a city that has one mezuzah, even if the entire city worships idols, does not qualify as a castaway city. This would lend itself to the view we mentioned in one of the classes earlier, that there is a view which states that Ir HaNidachas, the castaway city, because of how difficult it is to actually happen, there was an opinion which stated that it never happened and never will happen. Now this view of Rabbi Lezer this caveat that any city which has one mezuzah in it cannot be deemed a castaway city would certainly support that notion. The likelihood of a Jewish city that doesn't even have one mezuzah in the whole city, or one scroll that has God's name on it, is very unlikely. So in this view, this caveat makes it almost 99.999% impossible for a castaway city to ever actually happen. And where does he derive his opinion? What's his source for this idea that even if there's one mezuzah, the city cannot qualify as an Ir HaNidachas, as this castaway city? Because the verse reads, "V'sarafta be'esh esa'ir v'eskol shlala kolel." You have to burn the city by fire and all of its property completely burnt up. And we discussed that at length. But, so that's the law. The law is that the entire city has to be burnt. And therefore, but when there is a mezuzah, if there's even one mezuzah in the entire city, we cannot burn it. Because the verse reads, the verse states, this is a verse in Devarim, Perek Chelek, Pasuk Dalet, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 4. The verse there is discussing the requirement for the Jewish people to eradicate any vestige of idol worship, or the mention of idol worship should be mentioned. Wherever you find its name, says the verse, you shall you shall completely eradicate the name of idol worship. And then the verse concludes, do not do that to your God. So all these things which you're required to do for idol worship, to destroy it and get rid of its name, that you're not allowed to do to God's name. So any scroll that has God's name on it is not allowed to be burnt. So now if you have Ir HaNidachas, if you have a castaway city, and in this castaway city, the law is you must burn down all the contents of the city. Now if one of the contents of the city is God's name written on a scripture, on a scroll, say a mezuzah or a Perek Chelek or anything else that has God's name inscribed on it, and the law is you're not allowed to destroy God's name, then that would mean this city cannot qualify to be completely burnt. So whereas the opinion in our Mishnah was, okay, you can't burn scripture, you can't burn scrolls that have God's name on it, fine, bury it and burn the rest of the city. Rabbi Lezer says no. If there is a God's name in it and therefore you cannot fulfill the dictum of burning down the city, then this city cannot qualify for it to be a castaway city, because only a city in which you can fulfill all the requisites, including burning it down, only such a city can qualify as Ir HaNidachas. And because the city has a scroll which has God's name on it and therefore cannot be burnt, so it does not qualify to fulfill the law of burning it down, therefore does not qualify as Ir HaNidachas. Which goes to tell you the power of one individual doing one mitzvah. This, in theory, this person can be a person who himself worships idols. And it so happens that he has a mezuzah. And because it has a mezuzah, not only does it bring God's protection to that home and to that individual, but the entire city, the whole city, in Rabbi Lezer's view, gets spared from being qualified as Ir HaNidachas because of one Jew who has one mezuzah, one mitzvah. It adds to the weight and the gravity of the notion of one Jew holding one holy object in his home. You know, there's one of the Rebbe's 10 mitzvah campaigns is the campaign for Bayis, Mali, Svarim, Yavid V'Chachamel. That's what the Rebbe termed it, which means to have a home full of books and those who study the books, meaning the books should become used. And the Rebbe would state that even though the entirety of the home is not filled with the books, There's all kinds of other furniture. There's empty space. There's a bedroom. There's a kitchen. But if those books become the center of the home, and everything else in the home is like elevated by the presence of these holy books, we have a similar idea here, where the mezuzah doesn't just elevate the status of that home, but the entire city's status is elevated, thanks to one Jew's mezuzah. Amazing, amazing idea of the importance of valuing the one mitzvah we do, and valuing sharing one mitzvah with one Jew. You have Chabad emissaries. You have Chabad emissaries that are permanently settled in a certain location, and then you have what's known as Perek Chelek, which is students, rabbinical students, who during their break in the summer or holidays, they travel to far-off cities that aren't big enough to have a permanent rabbi, and they go there and serve the spiritual needs of the few Jews that are there. I've merited to do such missions when I was a student, spent Pesach in various small cities in Australia and other locations. And in many of these places you have 3, 4, 5 Jews, sometimes even less. You're driving to small little towns and you meet one Jew in the whole town. And here you see the value of that. One Jew in one small little town puts up one mezuzah and the entire city status is elevated. What a wonderful and important message and idea. Okay, now we get to the law of what happens once the city has been burnt down. The verse states that it cannot be rebuilt. By way of introduction, 2 introductions actually. First, let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is on Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Beis 111b, the end of the Mishnah. So it's just as the lines get wider. The Mishnah quotes the verse. The entirety of the verse is as follows. This was actually the second introduction I wanted to make, but we'll do that one first. The entirety of the verse reads it like this. After it says, you shall gather all of its property to the square, to the center of the town. All of its property you shall gather into the square or to the thoroughfare of the city. And you shall burn by fire the whole city. And all of its content, all of its property. Kalil completely la Hashem unto God, your Lord. And then it says like this: and it shall be an eternal mound, meaning a ruin. Don't build it again. So the prohibition against rebuilding the city is expressed in 2 ways. In a positive commandment, it shall remain a mound forever, and also expressed in a negative commandment, thou shalt not rebuild it. Okay. Now, the Mishnah stated, the verse states in the positive commandment, you shall leave it as a mound forever. This means, that means you shall not make it into gardens and orchards. Rabbi says Rabbi Yosef Aglili's opinion. So Rabbi Yosef Aglili says you cannot make it into, or you cannot even make it into gardens and orchards. Certainly you can't rebuild it as a city, but you can't even turn it into gardens and orchards. That's Rabbi Yosef Aglili's view. Rabbi Akiva's view is the verse says don't make it again. Therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, this means don't make it again to the way it was. To the way it was before, you cannot rebuild it. But you could make it into gardens and orchards. So in Rabbi Akiva's view, you cannot do anything with this mound, not even make it into gardens and orchards. Rabbi Akiva's view is, no, you can make orchards and vineyards there, but you cannot rebuild it into a city as it was. This is a dispute between Rabbi Yosef Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, whether you're allowed to put orchards and vineyards in the place where the Ir HaNidachas was. Are you allowed to do that? Like Rabbi Akiva says, and the prohibition is only not to rebuild it as it was as a full city, whereas Rabbi Yosef Aglili says you cannot do anything, you must leave it as a mound forever, it has to remain ruined, you can't even build orchards and vineyards, you can't even plant or create orchards and vineyards in that space. Introduction number 1 is this dispute. Introduction number 2. There is a rule as follows. Klalo prat, iatadan elok ein haprat. in our morning prayers, before we begin the formal prayer, we read a Mishnah which begins with which is there are 13 principles through which the Torah is derived. And the Mishnah there lists 13 principles by which our sages analyze the text of Scripture and derive at various laws and understandings. And the Gemara is replete, and the Mishnah is replete with such interpretations. One of the principles are klalu prat. When Scripture states a commandment in a general form, and then it specifies. So there's a general commandment, and then there's a specific commandment, followed by a specific injunction. Then the entirety of the general rule is restricted to something similar to the particular. Right? If it was just the particular, then the Torah would just say the particular commandment. If it meant the general any, then the Torah would just state the general commandment. By the fact that there's a combination of these two, a general mitzvah, and then the Torah goes on to specify a specific within that general, it means that the entirety of the general is restricted to the particular item. I hope that's somewhat clear. It'll become more clear as we go forward, but keep that in mind. So, first the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shimon Omer Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, etc. The Gemara quotes the relevant Mishnah which we just read earlier. The dispute between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yossi Haglili, whether or not you're allowed to rebuild the area of the Ir HaNidachas as a orchard and vineyard, or does it have to be left desolate completely. So the Gemara suggests, let us suggest that Rabbi Abin Bari Lo Kamifali. Let us suggest that Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Kiva, who dispute as to whether or not you're allowed to, everybody agrees you're not allowed to rebuild the city as a city. But Rabbi Akiva is of the view that you may rebuild it into orchards and vineyards. Let us suggest that their dispute is predicated on whether or not they assume the opinion of Rabbi Abin in the name of Rabbi Loi. For Rabbi Abin said in Rabbi Loi as follows: whenever you find a general principle in the Torah stated as a positive commandment, uprat beloisase, and the particular that follows is not also a positive commandment but a negative commandment, a don't do, then ein don bekalu prat, then you do not have the principle of the general and the particular. So he said before that there's a rule that when you have and the Torah has a commandment that's stated in a general form, and it's followed by the commandment stated in a particular form. And we said that the general rule is then restricted to the particular of the following commandment. So Rabbi Abin says in the name of Rabbi Beloy as follows. Rabbi Abin says like this, that rule is only true when the general commandment is of a positive nature, do something, and then it's followed by a particular commandment, a specific commandment within that general rule, also in a positive nature, do this specifically. Then you could say the general principle is restricted to the limited and limited to the particular. But if the general principle is a positive commandment, do something, and it's followed by a restrictive, don't do, then the two are unrelated. And you cannot restrict the positive commandment to the negative commandment. And this would be the basis for the dispute between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yossi Haglili. How so? And I hope now as we read this, it's going to become a little more clear. So we're going to go to the right-hand side, where we have Rashi's commentary. So you see Rashi has the bold letters, Klal Ba'aseu Prat B'Loisaseh. Going, for example, our very verse. The verse states, V'hoisetel olam, it shall be for a mound forever. That is a positive commandment. It shall be left as a mound. Klal, and it's a general principle. It doesn't specify what you can't do. It just says, leave it. Leave it alone. Then that would mean, Dafilu B'Nisayim Loisasa. That would mean, don't even make vineyards and orchards, because it says, leave it as a mound. It doesn't specify, so it means anything. Don't do anything then. And Latia Tel Olam. Rather, it should remain a mound forever. Shuhuase, that's a positive commandment. Leave it as a mound forever is a positive commandment. It does not specify. It's a positive commandment and it's a klal. It's a general rule. It does not specify. It just says leave it, which would preclude doing anything. Don't build it, certainly not. Don't put vineyards, orchards, nothing. Leave it as a mound. It's a general principle which precludes, it's a general positive commandment which says leave it alone, thus precluding the action of anything. But then it's followed by a verse which says Lo sivna oid, do not build it again. Now, do not build it again is, number one, it's a negative commandment, do not. And number two, it's a specific. Don't do what? Don't do building. Binyan batimu. It's a specific to building homes. V'hu loisaseh, and this is a negative commandment. Don't build homes. Now, these two, a general principle, leave it alone forever, positive commandment, unspecified, and then followed by a negative commandment, do not, and that specific, do not build, ein dononoise b'kala prat. Rabbi Abin is stating, do not use the rule of the general followed by the particular. Loimar, to say, ein b'chlal, that the general is restricted, elamash b'prat, only to that which is in the particular. Don't restrict the original commandment of the general rule, the positive commandment, which says, leave it alone. Don't restrict that to the specifics of the next negative commandment, which is, do not build homes. Right? The Pirush, that would mean like this. If you were to restrict the general of the positive commandment to the specific of the negative commandment, then that would mean to say, you should leave it alone forever. Lebinyan, specifically to building as a, leave it alone as a not to build. Which means, but gardens and orchards, surely that would be allowed. Ella rather, there are two separate issues. As the verse is saying. We don't say that the negative commandment is coming to explain the first half. Ella mili ka'amar, telling us two different things. First it says, first the verse says I shall leave it alone as leave it alone, positive commandment, general rule. That means don't do anything. Means don't even build orchards. And then there's a separate, individual, negative commandment, don't build it again. Any building. And therefore means even orchards and vineyards. Like Tivno, it shouldn't be built again. And therefore, so why the redundancy? It comes to tell you like this. The fact that the Torah went on to say the general principle, don't rebuild it. And then it went on to say a specific, it says a general principle, leave it alone forever. And then it went on to say specific, don't build it as buildings. It's coming not to restrict the general principle that it has to be exactly like the specific, but rather the specifics come to teach you something about the general. In the same way, the specific here is don't build it as buildings, meaning you're doing some act of building. So likewise, when it says leave it alone forever, it means leave it alone from doing something specific, like for example, orchards and vineyards. So let's explain this in simple language. The verse said, "V'hoisa tel olam," it should be left alone forever. Positive commandment without specifying how. And then the verse states, "Do not rebuild it again." Negative commandment, very specific. Building, specific to building. Don't build. Now, when it says "don't build," is that coming to explain the first half? When it says "leave it alone," it's coming to explain it and say, "Oh, when I told you earlier leave it alone, I meant specifically don't build buildings." That's one way of thinking it. That would mean the particular that followed the general is coming to restrict the general to only the specific. And that way, and therefore when it said, leave it alone forever, that's restricted to what follows, which is don't build. That's one way of thinking about it. If that's the case, that would be the view of Rabbi Yisrael Lili, which is don't even make orchards and vineyards. No, I'm sorry, that would be the view of Rabbi Kiva, which restricts and says that you're allowed to make orchards and vineyards. Why? Because when the verse said, leave it alone forever, it's restricted to the commandment which follows later, don't build buildings. And therefore the only prohibition of leaving it alone, or the only commandment to leave it alone, is that you should not rebuild buildings, because the general principle was restricted to the specific negative commandment, and the specific negative commandment here was, don't build buildings, which says, therefore, you're allowed to build orchards and vineyards. That's one view. That would mean that the specific of the negative commandment, don't rebuild buildings, restricts the general rule, leave it alone. And when it says to leave it alone, it's limited to don't rebuild buildings. One understanding of the verse. Or the verse is saying two different things. Number one, leave it alone forever. Positive commandment, leave it alone forever, don't even make orchards and vineyards. And then the verse says a separate thing. You should know, don't build buildings. So what that does is, it adds a negative prohibition to the positive and tells you that the positive commandment, which says to leave it alone, means don't do specific active buildings. but not you're restricted to specifically don't build actual buildings, but don't do activated things, just like buildings are meant for people to live in. So anything which is meant for people to enjoy shouldn't be done. And that would include even don't make orchards and don't make vineyards. And that would be the view of Rabbi Seglili, which said that when the verse said, tell Olam, you should leave it alone forever, that should be left as a general principle. Don't do anything with it. Don't even make orchards and vineyards. Because the specific negative commandment which followed, which says, don't make it into buildings, does not restrict the original principle rule of the positive commandment to leave it alone. It only helps us understand what it means to leave it alone. Leave it alone, as in, don't build things that humans enjoy, including orchards and vineyards and gardens. Hope that was somewhat clear. So let's go back to Gemara. Tamar Islay Rabbi Abin, one of the two is of the view of Rabbi Abin. Rabbi Yossi Galili does follow Rabbi Abin. Rabbi Abin said that the particular negative commandment, don't build buildings, does not restrict the original principle of the positive commandment, which was leave it alone. And therefore, it remains forbidden to build gardens, orchards, and vineyards. Umar, but master, the other one, Rabbi Akiva, Leslie Rabbi Abin, disagrees with Rabbi Abin. And if he is of the view that the general principle of leave it alone is restricted by the negative specific commandment, don't build buildings, and therefore the only thing forbidden is to build buildings, but building orchards and making vineyards and gardens is permissible. That's what the Gemara is suggesting is the root of the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi. Says the Gemara, no. The Kula Alma, everybody's of the opinion, the Islu de Rabbi Abin. Everybody, in theory, everybody agrees with Rabbi Abin that when there is a specific negative commandment, it does not restrict the preceding general positive commandment. So if that's the case, why does Rabbi Akiva permit the rebuilding of orchards and vineyards? Seemingly, the positive commandment to leave it alone remains in effect. Leave it alone. Says Gemara, no. Here they're disputing with respect to the translation of the words. Mar Savar, Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion which says, oid, the word oid in the verse says, do not build it again. That word again means the Gamri Masha completely. The word oid, which translates as again, can also mean Laisivna oid, don't build it forever. Meaning the word oid means, don't do anything. Don't rebuild it forever. And therefore even gardens, vineyards, orchard, you can't rebuild. But Umar Savar, Rabbi Akiva of the view that the word oid, do not build it again, means exactly that. Don't build it again, to the way it was. But in some new form. It used to be a city, now it's orchards and vineyards and gardens. That's permissible. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Seglili both agree in principle with the rule that when you have a negative specific commandment, it does not restrict the general positive commandment. However, here they are arguing with respect to the translation of the word oid. Do not build it oid. Does that mean do not build it forever, and therefore that precludes any type of rebuilding, including orchards and vineyards and gardens? Or does the word don't build it oid, don't build it again, mean don't build it again? Don't build it again to the way it was. But you may rebuild it in some new form, namely into gardens, orchards, and vineyards, and that's the view of Rabbi Akiva. Hope that was somewhat clear. If it's not, of course, email me, text, call, put in the comments, and let us know. And looking forward to continuing our Gemara tomorrow, God willing. Have a wonderful day, everybody.